Hey, ladies, welcome back to another episode of the Purpose Beyond Motherhood podcast. I'm Holly, and I'm here with Nicole.
Hey, friends.
We are so happy you're here, and we are so excited for our conversation today. We have a dear friend of mine, a newer dear friend of mine. Her name is Clayr. Hi, Clayr.
Hey, Clayr.
We're doing good. I told her before we started recording, I was like, I'm going to let you intro yourself because I will forget a qualification or something really cool that you could share that I wouldn't know. So Clayr, will you tell us just a little bit about yourself? And then we're going to get into a conversation about grief and lament. And I'm excited for that, but you go right ahead. Oh.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm like, congratulations.
Seriously. Amazing. Okay. I love your background and all the things you've done. I'm like, how do you have time to teach seminary while you go. Are you teaching at seminary or you're teaching at? Yeah. I would imagine. You're teaching marriage and family? Or you're okay. That's so cool. That's amazing. Okay. So before, actually, Clayr and I had this conversation at a children's basketball game, but I was like, we need to have you on the podcast. And would you be interested in talking about grief? And then she was just telling us we were going to kind of dive into lamenting a little more. So Clayr, I'm just going to let you just go and we'll ask you questions along the way.
I would say when you told me that you wanted me to talk about grief, it was kind of weird because I have felt like the last couple of years that God has wanted me to talk about my grief journey. For 2 years, I have, and maybe more like a year and a half, I've really been, I'm going to say like in the pit. I've been calling myself a pit person. That's kind of what I tell myself, that I've been the pit person, right? But really my grief story, back in 2022, fall of 2022, I experienced within 7 weeks, 3 family members who passed away. On top of that, that fall experienced job loss with my husband. And then that kind of created a whole bunch of other, when life gets that crazy, it creates a whole bunch of other things. On top of that as well, I've also been walking through an infertility journey with somebody very, very, very close to me. And I won't disclose anything because I want them to be able to share their own story. But it kind of ended up being this compounded grief over the last 2 years. And as a counselor, you would think, oh, you know how to deal with grief, right? Like, you've got this, like, you have all the tools, you got the toolbox, you know what to say, like, you've studied it. And I found myself in the pit looking at myself like, I don't even know where to turn. Like, I have no idea. I'm just sad, I'm depressed, and kind of living in a fog in some sense. And so as I kind of was in that place, I found, just this holy lament in the Bible, just the concept of, we have grief in the Bible, we see that. We talk about bereavement, like there's different types of grief, right? There's bereavement, there's, the silence grief, or quiet grief that you might hear, like with infertility, miscarriage, that sort of thing. You have compounding grief, anticipatory grief. But one of the things that I found was this compound grief, just this one loss after another. And I think a lot of your listeners who are probably walking this infertility journey can probably find themselves saying, I can relate to that. Because when you walk through infertility or you walk through, pregnancy loss, child infant loss, it really becomes compounded, right? Like it's not just one loss typically. It's kind of a lot of losses. And then there's all these unforeseen losses or, silent losses, things like a loss of a dream, a loss of a hope, a future, a goal. And so it compounds. And so I feel like with that compounding grief, the one thing that the Lord led me to was just this idea of lament. And so it's been kind of a beautiful thing. And I don't know if you want me to go ahead and kind of talk through that. I could talk through more about like types of grief or even like how you experience grief, or I could go into lament. I don't know if you guys have a preference about what that looks like.
Really, do you hear my dog snoring?
I do. I was going to ask you a couple times. I was like, is she snoring?
I'm so sorry. She's literally right there, like dead asleep.
That's hilarious.
Really, if you feel like you need to talk about grief to then move into lament, however you feel like it flows.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, and so I guess like one of the things as I'm kind of thinking through like even my own story of grief, right? One of the things that helped me was as I started studying the Bible, I think in the Bible, we see the end, right? Like you can read Joseph, like the story of Joseph. You can read the story of David. Like you hear about all these people who've gone through a lot of loss, right? And you can look at their life and you say, how did they go through this? David, he was running from Saul. You had Joseph, who was literally in a pit, right? That's where I get my pit person analogy from. In that pit, in that place, they didn't see the end. We have the exciting, part where we get to see their end. But I think sometimes as we're navigating grief and as we're looking to God and even our faith through our grief journey, it's hard because we can look at that and we say, well, we see the end, right? Like we know what God does, but we don't see that for our own life. And I think I had to come to the realization in my own journey that it was okay not to see the end. And I think that's the hard part, especially when you're walking through some really, difficult things that are outside of your control. Infertility, miscarriages, like nothing is in your control. And so as a believer, it's really easy to sit there and say, yeah, I trust God. However, like, is he really going to do this? And you get to that point. And I think the biggest question for a lot of people is, do you see me, God? Right? Like I was sitting there after going to, like, I literally had a funeral dress and I was like, okay, I guess here's my funeral dress. Like, let's put it on again. Okay, here, and thinking about financial instability, as we walk through job loss and we changed churches. So like even our community changed. Like it just felt like during that season, so much had changed and so much had been kind of taken from us. That I was sitting there and the biggest question was like, God, do you see me? Like, do you really, has your grace gone from me? Like, are you still going to be gracious to me? I think the other part of grief and when you go through grief is you start to even kind of associate it with punishment, right? And you see Job, like his friends did that. Like, what have you done? Like, clearly you've done something to make God, punish you like this. And one of the things too, I want people to understand is that grief and when you go through painful things and you go through loss, it's never because of punishment. Like God does not punish us. Like he's just not that kind of God, right?
Yes.
And I think that's something that people misunderstand sometimes is they think like I must have done something or I must not be at a certain point enough, in my faith journey. And that's just not how God works. I kind of, one of the things like Holly and I have also connected through our church. And one of the whenever I hold on, let me go back up. My mind's like going like, where do I want to go with this? So 2 years ago when everything happened and we experienced just this compounding loss after loss after loss, we changed churches. And it was February, it was 2 years ago this month that we changed churches. And the first Sunday that we were there, I was in the back and kid you not, so the pastor was talking about John chapter 1, verse 47, when he called Nathanael to follow him, right? And he talked about how one of the things that Jesus said to him was, I saw you sitting under the fig tree. That was it. Like he didn't, Jesus didn't have anything else to say. He just said, I saw you under the fig tree. And we don't really know what all of that means. But as the pastor was saying that, like, y'all, I was in the back bawling my eyes out.
Oh.
I'm pretty sure everybody around me thought I was some crazy like lunatic who was new to the church. But
No way.
But I was sitting there crying because it was almost like a light bulb went on in my head. Like, God sees me, right? Like, I am down at my lowest. Like, I could not get lower. And my hurt and my grief was just so low. And for even in that one moment when God said, I saw you under the fig tree, like, I saw you there. And I'm sitting there going, he sees me here, right?
Yes.
Like, he sees you. And I think that's one of the things too I want people to understand is that whether you're listening right now in the car or you're listening while you're putting on your makeup or cooking dinner or going on a walk, like, God sees you here, like, today, like, in whatever state you're in, whatever mourning or wailing or hurt you're in, like, he knows, and it doesn't go unseen. And so anyway, so that was, kind of where that kind of started my process into this lament, into this figuring out, like, okay, God, I've got to learn how to hold this, or at least shoulder it enough to go through it, because I can't get rid of it. Like, grief has no timeline. It's something that we all experience. It's a human, experience.
Right.
And it's not something that you're going to ever get rid of. Like, you can't get over grief, right?
Yeah.
And so in that moment, I was like, Lord, I don't know how to get through this, but help me. Like, help me figure out how to shoulder this.
Yes.
And so through then, it's been a couple of years since that, like, that whole time period. And since then, we've had other losses and other things. But he really showed me, like, as far as what lament really means. And I want to just kind of give you a little bit of a background, I guess, or even just definition. And I did write some notes, so I'll be looking at my steps.
Yes.
But I want to make sure I get it all there. So lament is really like this passionate experience of grief or sorrow. And it's this like beating of one's like breast, right? Like, if you think of somebody who is in such pain, it's this wailing, this deep seated cry of your heart, right?
Yes.
And I think any woman who has experienced loss and miscarriage after miscarriage after miscarriage, or have experienced not just infertility loss, but then you put on top of that, losses in other areas or other aspects, you can get to this very deep cry. Like, it's a heart cry, right? And again, it kind of goes back to the underlying question of, like, God, have you forgotten to be gracious to me? Like, has your love ceased? Like, are you there? Do you see me? And so I started going through the Psalms, and one of the things I started doing, and this is something I would tell every woman who's going through a dark season, get on your phone the Bible on Audible. Just download the Bible on Audible, whatever it costs. I don't know. Like, at that point, I just downloaded whatever I could get. And I just went and started going on walks in my neighborhood, and I just listened to somebody read the Psalms over me. Because at that point, I could not physically sit down and read it for myself. Like, I just was not in that space.
It's really
so
good.
Whatever you have to do, go and walk. Let somebody feed that to you. And as I was doing that, I started hearing David's true cry of his heart, right? Because laments really are a prayer of pain. That's what they boil down to. It's just a prayer of pain that leads to a further, deeper connection with God.
That's good.
And that's what it's meant to do. And so as I started reading the Psalms, one of the Psalms that stuck out was Psalm 13, right? And David, it starts with, like, God, why have you forsaken me? And I think every woman who's gone through something can probably utter those same words. It's like, have you forsaken me? Have you turned your back? And so anyway, as I was doing that, one of the things I started to also do is also to journal. And again, I would say journal. It doesn't have to be pretty. Like, laments are not prescripted. Like, they're not something that you have to have a certain formula for. It's messy. It's just a messy prayer. Kind of like, what is this song by Maverick City when you're talking to Jesus? Have y'all heard that song? I love that song. But it talks about how, like, you just talk to Jesus, right? You just tell him whatever's there. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to have any kind of formula as far as, what you're trying to tell him. You just need to get out those emotions. And so I would tell women right now, like today, start having the Psalms being read to you, just sit there, listen to them, start allowing yourself to then put on paper how you feel. One of the quotes that I like is that laments are really a historic minor key melody that God's people sing, right? Like it's this sad like melody, right? But yet when you think about the power that's in those and the power that's even in a minor key note, right? Like there's something to that. And so laments, they don't just emote, like it's more than just emoting. It's really trying to direct our pain and our struggle to renew our brokenness, right? To renew that part of us that's broken. And so the process, kind of talking through the process of lament, there's different, you'll kind of find there's different people who have different processes of like how you can go through it, but it kind of boils down to 4 steps. And I like that it's 4 steps because when you're in grief, you have like no capacity to do anything, right?
Yeah.
Like you can't do anything else. And so there's 4 steps really to this process of lament. One is like turning or addressing, right? The next is a complaint, which I like that because when I'm in the middle of something hard, I don't want you to tell me to suck it up.
Right.
Like I'm not a suck it up buttercup kind of girl. Like I'm a let me tell you how I really feel. And then there's also this ask, and then there's trust. And it all boils down to that last thing of an expression of trust. And so I will kind of walk through Psalm 13 a little bit and kind of show you how you can do this and how somebody could actually do this themselves as they're processing through, because David gives us such a good example of this. In Psalm 13, again, David kind of clearly addresses God. He starts intimately with addressing who God is, right? Like he knows God. It's not like, hey, you man, like it's God, like my God. Like, my God, why have you forsaken me? He's yelling out in pain. He's yelling out in anger. So that first thing is address God. Let him know that you see him. He sees you. Like, you know who he is. And what he does is he acknowledges not only that there's an intimacy there, but there's also hurt, right? Like there's a yelling. There's a deep guttural kind of feeling that goes on when he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? My God, why are you not there? Like, have you turned your mind from me? And then the next one is really just that complaint. And again, I like complaint. Some people might call it a request or not a request. They might have a prettier word for it, but I like the complaint because he again goes, why have you forsaken me? How are you far from me? Right? I'm in anguish. And he goes like asking God, I'm crying out to you by day. I'm crying out to you by night. Like you are not answering me. And so as you're sitting there and you're trying to write down your laments, or even as you're talking to God, cry out with whatever it is. Like in your closet, I have been known to get in my closet and just have those very vocal conversations. And I'm sure my husband and others are like, what's this girl doing? She's crazy. But do that, right? This first part, you're supposed to give it all to God. That's what he wants. He is big enough to take all of it. He already knows your heart. He's already there. He knows how you feel. And David uses this time to also, during that same complaining process, he also uses that time to remind God, you saved other people. Like you were there for them, right? Like he points to other things and says, you've done this. Why are you not doing it for me? And how much, what woman here who's listening today can probably say that? Like, you've given somebody else a baby, why not me? You've provided X for somebody else, why not me? And he doesn't hold back. Like, he just doesn't hold back. And so he lays it all down. And one of the things, as I was thinking about it too, and this is kind of a whole separate conversation, but God sees our tears, and it says in scripture that he bottles them up, right? And one of the cool things is like in scripture, when you bottled up your tears, like there were women who would bottle their tears and they would lay it at the feet of their husband as like an act of basically saying like, I'm giving you all my vulnerabilities, right? Like I'm giving you everything kind of thing. And as I'm thinking through even God, like holding those tears for us, like there is something so special about that and so personal and intimate. And I think we miss that when we're so focused on what we don't have or what loss we've gone through, that we miss the fact that God is carrying it with us, right? Like he's there. And so then that third step is really a request. And what David cries next is like, Lord, don't be far from me. Like, you are my strength. You need to come help me, like, deliver me. He goes through this long list of like, help me, deliver me, come quickly. And it's a real specific request, right? He asks to be saved. And I think our natural inclination is to kind of pull away, and kind of do it on our own, or when we go through grief, even to turn away from God, because we think, like, I've got to figure this out. I've got to pull myself up from the pit. And you really can. And I think too, even in my own grief and even on my own journey, like, one of the things I try to do is keep myself busy, right? Distract myself. Like, if I distract myself enough, maybe, I'll figure it out, or maybe something, will just miraculously change. I think too, one thing I experienced was, because of so many losses and so many compounding losses, I started getting a lot of anxiety about, what am I going to lose next? Like, what's next for me? And so I tried to control everything in my world. Like, I just, oh my goodness, we have to stay healthy. Oh my goodness, we have to do this. Oh my goodness, I have to, change what we eat or change what we do. Even the friendships, like, I have to make sure that people are not leaving me, right? Because I didn't want to be abandoned, because I just lost 3 people, in a matter of 7 weeks. And yet what I found is I was just tired at the end. Like, I cannot control it. I have to submit to God and say, God, this is what I need you to do. And be bold in that and say, God, I can't do it, but I need you to do X. I need you to save me. I need you to pull me out from this pit. And so that's something that I learned. Also, ironically, I'll kind of give you a little like disclaimer. As I was trying to control everything, kid you not, my kid, that next year, like after everything happened and we were in January, for 7 months, we had strep every single month. Like, so I feel like God was just kind of
my gosh.
like, he didn't do it, right? It wasn't like God doing that to me, but it was just the like, okay, like, I can't really do this, right? Like, I cannot keep everybody healthy and everybody okay. And I can't worry about that next loss, right? Because loss will happen at some point, but I can't worry about it. But it was just kind of a funny thing that I was like, Lord, I'm trying and it's not working.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. We know that when everything feels like it's out of control, you're like, I'm going to control this, just this little thing, this little section, this little corner. And that's so not,
And so, yeah, so it's just, that's one of the things, sorry, that I think God like really put on my heart, is like to just be very specific in my requests to what I need, and to not run from it, and to not run from him, and to not run from those emotions. And then the last thing is really this expression of trust, like going back to trust, right? Because lament always leads to a deeper connection with our Lord. It always does. And so it concludes like, you brought me out of the womb. You made me trust in you, even at my mother's breast. I will declare your name to my people in the assembly, and I will praise you. Like, that's amazing, right? Like, there's like this like beauty throughout the Psalms where like David, in all of his Psalms and all of his lamenting, he always ends with, I will praise you, right? Like, I'm still here, you're still here, and I have to trust. And so, even though David accused God of being silent, being aloof, not being there, he ends with praising him and expressing that I will trust you even if.
Good.
And like today, like, what is it for you, right? Like, what do you have to say? Like, God, I'm going to trust you even if, right? And that's where it boils down to, to us, like, for all of us. And I always tell clients, because I think sometimes David can get a bad rap, I feel like, because he's like so emotional, and people are like, oh, like, you shouldn't be emotional. But like, emotions are a good gauge, right? It gives us a good gauge of where we're at. And it can also give us a good gauge of where we're at spiritually. They're just not good guides, right? David didn't allow his emotions to guide him, but he allowed his emotions to set like a gauge for him, so that he could then participate in this holy lament, this lamenting process, to get him back to where he needed to be, which was ultimately trust, right? So those 4 steps are kind of what I would suggest for anybody going through grief. I'm not going to say throw away all the other things, right? Like, there's a lot to be said about the 5 stages of grief, and there's a lot to be said about the tasks of grief and all of that. And like, I think cognitive behavioral therapy is great. I think all of that stuff is wonderful. However, in the process of while you're doing some of these other things, go through these 4 steps.
It's good.
Sit down and open your Bible, open your journal, take a walk, listen to the Psalms, allow yourself to beat on your breast, right? To mourn, to wail. But don't sit there, right? You have to get out your ask, get out your complaint, get out your request, and then express your trust.
Yeah.
So those are kind of the things that
That's good.
I wanted to kind of lay out for women.
Absolutely.
So I don't know if you have any questions or anything like that, but I can also tell you a
I
little
know.
bit more about Lament.
I was going to say that was so good. And may I be just so bold in saying, I think that is like, I think you unlocked something there.
Totally.
Which is really, really beautiful because, I mean, even for myself is that, when I'm in the pit, I'm like, okay, I bring it to the Lord, or I'm still frustrated, but it's like, what is that next step? Like, how can I just take it a step further? And you just made that so real and so practical in what you shared with us. And so I'm like, I'm excited.
Yes.
I'm like, it's okay. Like I can lament to the Lord and walk through those 4 things and, and wait on him and trust him. And so thank you. Like you really made that so real. So that was beautiful. Thank you so much.
Well, like these 4 steps. So again, there's different people who will use different names and that some might add some steps, that sort of thing. But there is a book, and right now my mind is going blank. It's Darkness and Mercy, or I can't remember. I'm not going to give the name. But
keep going.
Is an author. I think he's a pastor in Indiana, I want to say, and he has written a book that kind of goes through. So if you're also looking for other resources too, just Google Darkness and Mercy. Well, maybe not. I don't know. That might lead you to
we'll find it and we'll put it in the show notes for real. But I just think that this conversation was 1, right on time, and 2, just so needed. And so just thank you for that.
Yeah.
I love that you gave action steps, because I feel like for me, I'm for sure ADD and all over the place, but I would like go back and listen to this. If I was back in my miscarriage in the thick of it, this would have been so helpful. So thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you for letting me share.
Yes.
Something that is really, really dear to me.
You did a great job.
I've experienced it myself, so I know I've gone through it, but not the exact same, but right? Like grief is
grief. Yeah.
In a sense, right? Like we might not understand each other's grief, but we can't necessarily presume to know what other people feel, right?
Right.
But we can at least know what we've felt, But,
yes. Yeah.
So
amazing.
Thank you so much.
Clayr, thank you. And also I'm thinking, just if someone wants to connect with you or maybe just go a little bit further or deeper, how's a good way for someone to be able to connect with you?
Yeah, I'd be happy to give you my my email. I'm also, they can reach out to me on social media. I don't check it as often. Email's probably the best.
Okay.
So I'd love to do that. I'm not in full-time private practice right now. I just teach right now, but I can give you my seminary email and they can reach out to me there.
Okay. I love that. Okay, cool. We will definitely put that in the show notes. But Clayr, we're so grateful for you.
Yeah, thank y'all so much.
Yes. You guys, thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Purpose Beyond Motherhood podcast. We have 1 more episode before this season wraps up. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week.